This video is brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, John Mezzo, Mike Rand, Cameron Strauss, Rodbot, Tom Smarty, Miriam H, newcomer Edward Pierre and Ben Hancock, and a special thanks to ARW for their contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Stormon video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. To be honest, despite only resigning the leadership around 4 years ago, I seriously forgot that Malcolm Turnbull was our Prime Minister at one point. Why is that? How did a man elected on a wave of optimism to bring order back to Canberra become nothing more than a footnote in the history of Australian politics? Let's find out as I put our 29th Prime Minister in the spotlight. Born in Sydney 1954, Malcolm Blight Turnbull would be the only child of a wealthy hotel broker. This allowed Turnbull to grow up with a relatively solid education, as well as giving him strong connections to powerful figures in both the government and private sectors. Using these connections, Turnbull would establish his own law firm, Turnbull McWilliam, along with one Bruce McWilliam. During this time, Turnbull would make his first breakout on the public stage when he defended Peter Wright from the British government, who would try to suppress his book, Spycatcher, which exposed questionable moves made by MI5 and MI6. A few years later, Turnbull would also establish an investment banking firm, Whitlam Turnbull & Co., alongside former New South Wales Premier Neville Wran and Nicholas Whitlam, the son of Gough Whitlam. However, by the 90s, Turnbull had turned his attention to politics. He'd previously run for the Liberal pre-selection in multiple seats, including Wentworth, but he would fail and would eventually let his party membership lapse. Rather than pursue a career in Parliament, Turnbull would instead head Keating's Republican Advisory Committee and would later become the face of the Republic movement. Despite the eventual failure of the Republic movement, the whole ordeal had made Turnbull a recognisable face. Using this newfound recognisability, Turnbull would turn his attention back to politics. Rejoining the Liberal Party, he would aim to win the seat of Wentworth off the incumbent Peter King. The 2004 pre-selection battle for the seat would turn quite bitter when King accused Turnbull of branch stacking. However, in the end, Turnbull would win, and despite King attempting to run as an independent, Turnbull would become the new member of Wentworth. Turnbull would quickly move up the ranks of Howard's fourth and final parliament to become Minister for the Environment and Water in 2007. Following Howard's defeat, Turnbull would run for the role of Liberal leader, but would fail to Brendan Nelson, despite having the backing of the media. Turnbull would instead become the Shadow Treasurer, but only a year later would challenge Nelson for the role of party leader, citing Nelson's poor performance in polls in comparison to then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Winning the challenge by 4 votes, Turnbull would assume the role of opposition leader right at the height of the GFC. During this time, Turnbull would attack the large spending and taxation policies of Labor, proposing his own solution to address the GFC, mostly tax cuts. However, he would make an absolute fool of himself in what came to be known as the Oz Car Affair, or Utegate, where he would accuse Labor of giving preferential treatment to a car dealer with links to the Labor Party. These accusations were in fact fake, and the whole ordeal would hurt Turnbull massively in the polls. However, what would eventually bring Turnbull down would be his support for Rudd's carbon pollution reduction scheme. This move was criticised by several high-ranking Liberals who would vote to instead Abbott as the party's new leader. Following the loss of the leadership, Turnbull would briefly consider leaving Canberra, but would be encouraged to stay by Howard and would become the Shadow Minister for Communications and later Minister for Communications following Abbott's 2013 landslide win. As Member for Communications, Turnbull would roll out the Coalition's alternative national broadband network plan, which would end up in massive cost overruns despite being promised to do the opposite. However, Turnbull's blunders in the NBN would have nothing on the controversies that Abbott himself was generating, and by the end of 2015, with the public clamouring for new leadership, Turnbull would challenge Abbott for the role of party leader, and would win with a much more comfortable margin of 10 votes. As Prime Minister, Turnbull would attempt to make the Liberal Party more palatable to the masses by shifting up Abbott's front bench to include more women and moderates. However, this move would not end up saving him from the massive swings against his party in the 2016 election, in which the coalition would be reduced to a single-seat majority. Now governing on the wire, Turnbull would perform a very dangerous dance as he attempted to pass progressive legislation while not angering his conservative base. This would result in policies like the same-sex marriage plebiscite, a costly political survey that showed what most polls had already shown for months. The reality was, despite all the moderate rhetoric, Turnbull governed almost identical to Abbott policy-wise, and this led him to not be very popular with the electorate. This lack of popularity was shown for the nation to see during the Super Saturday by-elections triggered by the citizenship crisis, where his ploy to steal seats of the Labour Party backfired with his government facing swings against it in all contested seats. It was shortly after this that Turnbull would face his political end when he once again tried to get the coalition to pass climate legislation. Despite yielding to the conservative wing of his party on most policy, in the end they would vote to depose him. Arguably, Turnbull would get the last laugh when, following his resignation from Parliament, his safe seat of Wentworth would fall to independent Karen Phelps, thus plunging the coalition into minority government. Turnbull would then go on to become one of the coalition government's biggest critics over its lack of climate policy. He would also team up with Kevin Rudd to push his Royal Commission into media ownership in Australia. Despite his frequent appearances on mainstream media, Turnbull would largely be forgotten by Australians, as events like the COVID pandemic took focus away from the leadership spills of the 2010s and instead put onto current issues. Thus, in my opinion, Turnbull has become nothing more than a footnote in Australian history. Going over to Patreon, we have ARW who says, Malcolm Turnbull is a man of many accomplishments and achievements, though most of these successes did not occur in politics but in his pre-political career, in which he left his mark in occupants as diverse as journalism, the law and merchant banking. Such extensive experience in the private sector should have made him an ideal candidate for the leadership of the Liberal Party, and its commitment to free enterprise and individual effort. But for various reasons, Turnbull was never a good fit for leadership of the party, which of course resulted in a rather lacklustre 3 years as Prime Minister. The overriding reason was that Turnbull rejected the reactionary policies that had predominated under John Howard, so the conservative wing of the party never trusted him. This tension is what underlaid the rivalry between Turnbull and Tony Abbott, and manifested itself most notably when Abbott defeated Turnbull for the leadership in 2009, when the latter supported the climate change policies of the Rudd government. But Turnbull's ultimate undoing was his lack of political skill and instinct. When he became Prime Minister in 2015, he had the enormous goodwill from the electorate for eliminating the toxicity associated with Abbott's leadership. His inability to propose policies of substance and lacklustre campaign skills saw him nearly lose the 2016 election after a very uninspiring campaign. After failing to win a series of by-elections in 2018, the Conservative wing agitated against him, with the stridently Conservative Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton launching a leadership challenge in August 2018. Turnbull was able to stare down Dutton just enough to prevent him from becoming leader, so Turnbull was still unable to continue in the job, and after a messy series of events left politics altogether, with his treasurer Scott Morrison becoming Prime Minister in his stead. In terms of output, Turnbull's policy record is probably the weakest of what I call the post-Howard Prime Ministers, and I mostly recall a sense of aimless drift in the way the government conducted itself, especially after the 2016 election. I'd say the government's most notable achievement was legalising same-sex marriage, but this was achieved only after putting the issue through an unnecessary nationwide vote first proposed by Abbott and upheld by Turnbull to keep the Conservatives in his party on side. While I do give credit to Turnbull for attempting to redefine the Liberal Party away from its reactionary conservatism and more towards the classical liberal principles, and for presenting an image of competence that his predecessor lacked, his inability to propose a meaningful policy agenda and achieve any degree of electoral success renders his overall record as Prime Minister as inconsequential at best. With that being said, I still rate him over Abbott, but not ahead of Ronald Gillard. Going over to YouTube, we have Patrick Kenny who says, while Malcolm Turnbull did try his best to try and enact some decent climate and social policy by attempting to increase renewable investment, pushing to legalise same-sex marriage, and attempting to improve the Liberal Party's culture towards women, he was ultimately unable to do many significant changes due to him effectively being held hostage by the hyper-conservative side of his party. Instead of just legalising same-sex marriage like an overwhelming majority of the public wanted to, he was forced to hold a postal vote on the issue by the right of his party. He was responsible for allowing the 9 Fairfax merger to go ahead, which further centralised the control of media in the nation. Turnbull was essentially just Tony Abbott, but with a more charming smile and demeanour. However, by the end of his term, the public began to see through this image. Ultimately, while Turnbull tried to push the Liberals back to the centre of politics, he was unable to achieve this, and it ended up costing him, with News Corp, radio shock jobs and his own party turning on him and ousting him in a similar way to how he came to power. However, I do have respect for him pushing against the power of News Corp and for increased climate action post-politics. I just wish that he pushed more of these things while he was Prime Minister. We also have Michael Coxlong who says, Turnbull was the best PM in the post-Rudd Gillard era, but that's not saying much. He tried to be flexible and appeal to both sides of the Liberal Party, but he was consistently undermined by the coalition's more conservative members, which made him look weak and spineless. Had he stepped up and showed some more tenacity, leadership and determination, it's possible he could still be in power today. but the problem was that he never looked in control and always let his party dictate things. He did introduce some decent reforms such as the snowy hydro and of course same-sex marriage, but Turnbull never felt like a Liberal Party man, and he could never easily be placed into the Labour Party due to his social liberal policies. He has remained active in political life since he lost the top job, and most recently he had joined Kevin Rudd in taking on the Murdoch media, which is admirable. Turnbull seems to be like a decent bloke with good principles, but he was not a good fit to lead the coalition. His attempts to unite the Liberal and Conservative factions of the government failed horribly and was plagued by infighting the whole time, which costed us years of good government and gave rise to the eventual Prime Ministership of Scott Morrison, the worst Prime Minister of modern times. We also have Lucid, who says, Turnbull ultimately failed to build himself a political base which he could rely on in the Conservative movement. To moderate suburban voters he was just a jellyfish on same-sex marriage and on climate change. To nationalists, his expansion of skilled migration while denying a path to citizenship drove down wages and decreased integration. To economic conservatives, he kiboshed GST reform and failed to deliver tax cuts. His innovative agenda was fluff, resulting in lower investment in research and reduction in advanced manufacturing which received incentives and declining capital flowing into industry. It became harder to start or grow a business due to inadequate finances, the majority of which went into the continuing housing boom. And Turnbull long opposed the Banking Royal Commission. Small businesses hated this. Even in his own party, he lost the support of the Kingmakers in Cormann's WA faction and found few loyal supporters. Further, Frydenberg had already captured his media contracts, excluding longtime friend Rupert Murdoch, who moved for different reasons, and made them his own. The achievement he can only truly claim as his own was Snowy 2.0, a white elephant that estranged both the environmental conscientious for depriving funding from better renewable investments and the nationals for treading over Kosciuszko, their very own Zion, without the customary bribes going into the regional power brokers. In politics, it is often said that if you want to be a friend, buy a dog. I imagine Malcom Turnbull would have even given back his checkers if they had given him an extra day in office. To me, Malcom Turnbull exemplifies the term out-of-touch elite when it comes to his time in politics. While he had good ideas, he was quite out of touch with regular Australians, and it was this lack of touch that would ultimately be his downfall. He became Prime Minister to unify the left and the right sides of politics, but arguably ended up being despised by both. With the fall of the Morrison government in 2022, Turnbull has, in some respects, finally achieved his goal of bringing climate change back to the forefront, but this has come at the cost of his own party, who now sit in opposition, and are likely to be even more conservative than when he left Parliament in 2018. Now, with Morrison being a bit too recent to cover, I'm going to hold off doing a video on him, and instead we'll look back to our oldest Prime Ministers, as some of the comment section have been requesting. So for my next video, I'm going to do a quick fire round of our first 4 Prime Ministers: Edmund Barton, Alfred Deakin, Chris Watson, and George Reid. So drop your opinions on any of these 4 Prime Ministers if you want to see them featured in my next video, and also be sure to join my Patreon if you want to guarantee your comments will be read out. Until then, I'll see you later.